Begin the Gemara today on Daf Nun, right at the beginning of the Yamod. The Gemara here is discussing limudim regarding hektish. By hektish, there's a unique halacha or unique rule that the Gemara brought before, that if you learn something from a hekish, you can't then learn from there to a second hekish. Okay, so now the Gemara is discussing this halacha, or this rule, like I said, whether this applies to other limudim. If you learn something from a hekish, could you then learn with a gzeira shava? Could you then learn with a Zevochim? So the Gemara discussed those till here. Now the Gemara goes on to a binyan av. If you learned something from a hekish, could you then learn from there to another place with a binyan av? The continuation of the Gemara is also going to discuss other limudim. When you have something that's learned with one limud, could you then learn from there to another case with a different limud? As we'll see all the details here in the Gemara. So the Gemara begins, Dava lamed behekish, if there's something that you learned only from a hekish, ma'o sheyalamed b'binyanav. Could that now become a source to learn out with a binyanav? The word binyanav, as we say every morning in the Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah Nidreshes, means that when I find the Torah saying something, it becomes a source that I learn out logically to compare it to other places. Or as Rashi says, the other lashon that's used regarding binyanav many times is mematzino. That just like I find here, this rule, I could just apply it elsewhere without any specific word or limud, but just logically. So that's the question. If I learned something with a hekish, could I then learn from there to another case with a binyanav? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, so Rabbi Yirmiyah proves this. Loi lichtov tzafayna ba'asham. The thing that we're discussing here in the Gemara was regarding this, that the blood has to be sprayed, that's before blood spraying, the carbon has to be shechted, that is, on the tzafan of the Azara. So now it wouldn't be necessary for the Torah to write that it has to be done in the north of the Azara ba'asham, regarding the carbon asham. V'teisi mibinyanav michatos, and you could then compare to what it says by the chatos that it has to be done in the north, and you would just learn it out with a binyanav, logically, that if the Torah says it by chatos, it should apply the same by asham. Why does the Torah write this regarding the chatos? Or again, regarding the asham, that is, lav. So isn't the reason lememra to teach you this cloud? The davar alamed behekish ein chayzer alamed bebinav. Why is this? Because by chatas itself, how do you know that it has to be shechted on the north? It doesn't say by chatas. It's learned with a hekish from the ayla. So if you're going to learn asham from the chatas, so that means you're learning from a case that it itself is only known from a hekish, and then you're comparing to another case with a binyanav. You can't do that. So therefore the Torah has to have a separate pasuk to teach that we learn the asham from the chatas, that you can't just learn with a binyanav. Okay, but the Gemara says, if this is your whole proof, according to your reasoning, you're asking, why do we not learn out the asham from the chatas with a binyanav? How about to learn it directly from the original source, where the Torah writes explicitly that it has to be done on the north, from the ayla itself? So my time yasi, what is the reason why we do not learn the asham that has to be in the tzafan directly from the ayla? That's mishum deikala mifrach, because there's a refutation to this limud. Mala ayla sheken kolil, the carbon ayla has a stringency that has to be entirely burnt in the mizbeach. Maybe that's why it has to be done in the north. But how could I learn from there to the asham that does not have to be burnt entirely in the mizbeach? So just like you can't learn from the ayla, chatas nami yekala mifrach, you can't learn out the asham from the chatas either with a binyanav. Because I can say, Malachata shekem echaperes al chai v'krisis. By the chatos, it brings an atonement for a very severe aveda like chai v'krisis. By the asham, though, it doesn't. So how could you learn the asham from the chatos? So therefore, the proof here of Rabbi Yirmiyah is not a proof. There's a refutation to this binyanav. Okay, but the Gemara says, Chada mechada lo yasya. I can't learn out one from one, as the Gemara just described. I can't learn out the asham from not the oila and not from the chatas. But teisi chodem etarti. Maybe I should learn out one from two. Now, in the simple pshat of the Gemara, it seems like the Gemara is continuing the thread of the point here, figuring out whether something that was learned from a hekish, whether then you can make a binyanav. And as we say in the lashon of the davening in the morning, there's a binyanav mikosav echad and binyanav mishnei ksuvim. When you have a binyanav, when you're learning it not from one case, but from two cases together. Or in the lashon of the Gemara, that's usually called atzad hashava. So now the Gemara is trying to prove this idea from whether you could learn this from atzad hashava. However, Rashi here, for some reason, says that this continuation of the Gemara is an inyan b'fnei atzmai. It's just trying to figure out regarding this halacha of tzafayna, whether the Torah has to write it by all these three cases, the oila, chatas, and the asham, or it could write one, or it could write two maybe, and you could learn out a third from two. Okay, so now the Gemara says, how would that be? Which one would the Torah not write, and I could learn it out from two? Mehei teisi, from which two would I learn out? If you would argue and say, let the Torah not write oila, that has to be on the north. V'teisi mechatas v'asham, and the Torah would write only by the chatas and the asham that has to be on the north. So I would say I can't learn the oila from them. Malahanoch shekei mechaprin. By these two, chatas and the asham, they bring a high level of atonement. Even though the carbon oila also is mechaper for an esse, but it's not the same level of atonement as it is with the chatas and the asham. So I can't learn out from there. Now, if you'll argue, let the Torah not write the halacha of tzafain regarding chatas. And learn out from the asham and the oila. I also can't learn from there because malahanoch, they are different. Both of them are shekain zecharim. They both have to be brought from animals that are zecharim, where the chatas is brought from an akeva. If you'd argue and say, don't write the halacha of tzafan by asham, v'teisim mehanach, and you learn out from the other two, from the chatas and the oila, malahanach sheken yeshnam b'tzibah kibiyachid. Chatas and oila are both karbanis that can be brought by an individual, and it's also brought as a carbon chatas as well, as a carbon tzibur, that is, where you don't find a asham that's brought for the tzibur. Therefore, there's no din of tzafan there either. Therefore, the conclusion here is there's no binyanav that you could learn out for this halacha of tzafin. Not a binyanav mikasav echad, not a binyanav mikshnei ksuvim, which the Gemara usually calls a tzad hashava. Therefore, we didn't prove this point whether adav alamed behekish, whether it could be learned out with binyanav or not. Okay, now we're done with the inyan of hekish. So the Gemara had discussed here all the different kinds of limudim, whether you could learn from a source that was originally learned from a hekish. Now the Gemara moves on to the next kind of limud, a gzeira shava. When you only know something with a source of gzeira shava, now to learn out from there to other cases with another limud, could that be done? By hektish. Again, the whole discussion here is specifically regarding hektish. So the Gemara, davar alamed b'gzeira shava, if you learn something out only with gzeira shava, ma'u shi alamed behekish. Could you then learn from there with the limit of a hekish? Rav Papa says, I'll prove you this point because by from the carbon taida. How does the pasuk open the halachas of carbon taida? V'zais taidas zevach hashlamim v'gaimer. It begins describing it as a zevach hashlamim, and then it says im al taida. And if this taida is this zevach hashlamim, right away in the next pasuk it says if this is going to be a carbon taida. So why does it say here shlamim, the expression of shlamim regarding the taida? So lamadnu l'taida, this pasuk teaches regarding the taida, shabas min ha'maiser. This hekish, the taida comparing the taida to the shlamim, is the source that tells us that by a carbon taida, you could bring your carbon taida from the maiser money. If you have the maiser sheni money that you bring to Yerushalayim, you could use that maiser sheni money for a carbon taida, which is a unique thing. Usually by karbanis, if a person has an obligation to bring a carbon, you can't use maiser for the obligation. You have to bring it from your chulin, from your own pocket, from your own money for the carbon. In this case, though, we learn from the shlamim that if when the person made the neder to bring the shlamim, he said, I'm making a neder to bring a shlamim from the meiser, and so then he's able to bring it from the meiser. And similar regarding the taida, if he makes a neder, I'm going to bring the taida from the meiser, we compare it to shlamim that you can bring it from the meiser. So how do we know this? Because with the ashkechan shlamim dasami meiser. Since I see the shlamim, if you make the neder in that way, it can be brought from the meiser. So too by the taida. Okay, so this is a hekish. Now shlamim gufayu, when it comes to the shlamim itself, minalan. How do we know that shlamim could be brought from the meiser money? That's learned from Gzeira Shava. The chsev sham. There's a lashon of sham that it says regarding the taida, regarding the shlamim that is, and there's the word sham that it says regarding meiser sheni. So I compare the two and say with the Gzeira Shava that a shlamim could be brought from meiser. So Rav Papa is saying, so I see right over here, this halacha that a shlamim could be brought from meiser is learned with a Gzeira Shava. And then from there, I learn with a hekish that the taida as well could be brought with from meiser money. So Mazutre asks on this, or Mazutre berei Rav Mari, that is L'Ravina, that this is not a good source. this is not a good proof for this concept that regarding hektish, you can't learn out a hekish after the original source was only learned from Gzeira Shava. Why not? Because Meister Dagon, where is the original Gzeira Shava to? The original Gzeira Shava is being learned out from Meister Dagon. Meister Sheni, from grain. That's Chulin Ba'almu. That's not in the category of hektish, it's Chulin. And we're looking to understand whether this concept of learning a hekish from a case that was learned from Gzeira Shava, all only in hektish. Now, regarding Chulin, you can do that. But the Shaila is only regarding hektish, so you can't prove to me from this case where the Gzeira Shava, the original Gzeira Shava, comes from where? From a case which is Chulin. Amalei. So Ravina answers back, Omar, Omra. The one that said this, did he say, the one that said this rule that by hektish, something that's learned from a Gzeira Shava, you can't then learn out from a hektish, from a hekish, that is. Did he, the one that said this, did he actually say it in this way, that only if the source that you learn from there is going to be hektish, then this applies? Lamad kaidesh or malamed kaidesh. That did he say? So this goes together. Amar Amra Lamed Kaidish and Malamed Kaidish. Did he actually say that both the source that you're learning from has to be hektish and the place that you're learning to has to be hektish? That's the two things the Gemara is saying here. There's the Lamed and there's the Malamed. So over here in this case, we're learning Gzeira Shava. So there's the source you're learning the Gzeira Shava from, which is Meister. That's actually Chulin. That's called the Malamed, the source where you're learning it out from. And then there is the case that you're learning it to, which is the Shlamim. That's hektish. So what Ravina is saying is, this concept, you have to have both the Lamed and the Malamed to be hektish in order to say that this rule applies, that we can prove from here that even though I learned from Gzeira Shava, I could still learn how to hektish. So you don't have to have them both to be hektish. Even if the original source, even if the Malamed is Chulin, but as long as the case you're learning it too, which is the Lamed, in our case it's Shlamim, that is hektish, so then that is a good proof. You could learn from here, it is a good proof to say that whatever is learned in the case of hektish, if you learned it from a Gzeira Shava, you could then learn it to a hekish. This lashon of the Gemara is an interesting lashon. There's a discussion here in Rashi and Tosfos about this. Omar Omra. So as I said before, the way Rashi teaches it is, we don't know who's the Tana or the Amayra that said this, so we don't have his name. So therefore the Gemara uses this expression, Omar Omra. Did the one that said it, whatever his name is, did he actually say this only in a case where Lamat Kaidish and Malamat Kaidish? That's how Rashi teaches it. But Tosfos says that it's like the term that the Gemara uses in other places, Eim, da Amret, when do you say, it's not this lashon of Omar Omra. Or Ben Tam says another gears in the Gemara, Imi Amra or Ami Amra. Ami is a name of a Chacham, so that's actually a name. Okay, but this Gemara over here is the source for what we had once before in the Gemara, and the Gemara brings this a few times. This rule regarding hektish, that you can't learn out with these double limudim. So according to one opinion, as we see here in the Gemara, according to one opinion, that only means also if it has to be the Lamed and the Malamed. It's not enough that we're talking about in the context of hektish for what you're learning out to, but it also has to be from the source that you're learning it from. That also has to be hektish. But another opinion says, no, you don't have to look at the original source, which in our case is actually Chulin, because it's Ma'aser Sheni. You just look at the Lamed. Look at the main limud here is where you're learning it to, which is Shlamim. That is hektish. You don't look at the Malamed. So here's this machlokes about this. Okay, so now the Gemara, as you see over here, there's a machlokes about this. Rav Papa did consider this to be a source because Rav Papa goes by the Lamed, and but then the Gemara brings other Amiroim here that argue with that and say, no, you go by the Malamed, and therefore this is not a good source for this. The Gemara moves on to a different case. Davar Alamed b'Gzeira Shava. If there's something that you only learned with Gzeira Shava, Ma'ashi Alamed b'Gzeira Shava. Could you then learn from there to another case, again with Gzeira Shava? So Rami Bachame says, I'll prove this to you also from the carbon taida, where there are different kinds of breads that are brought with the carbon taida. And Tanya, we learned in the Braisa about this. It says in the pasuk, Seiles Murbeches. So if you look there in the pasuk, the Gemara here is going to discuss, there's three different kinds of breads that we're discussing here. The pasuk starts here with saying there's chalois matzos, and then there's rikike matzos. So chalois matzos, that's challah. baked like challah. Then rikike matzahs is made like matzahs, like a thin matzah. And then there's another thing that the pasuk says, soiles murbeches chalais belulis b'shemen. These soiles murbeches was also chalais, but the flour was first taken and was placed into boiling hot water. It's a bagel. That's what it basically is.
That's what they do.
Right. Okay. Right. Exactly. It's boiled first. It's boiled first over here. It's boiled in boiling hot water, and then afterwards they make out of it the challah. Okay, so now regarding this third category in the pasuk, it clearly spells out what kind of flour you should use. It says soiles, which is a fine flour. So lamadnu l'revucha, this third category that's boiled in hot water, so shabah soiles. The pasuk is clearly saying that it has to be from the fine flour. However, in the other two categories in the pasuk before, it doesn't say that. So how do we know what kind of quality flour it has to be? Chalois minayin. How do I know? And it says in the pasuk chalis matzahs that it should also be from this fine flour. So the answer is that's Gzeira Shava. Talmud loymar chalois. By the soiles murbeches it says the word chalois, and by chalis matzahs it says the word chalois. So that's Gzeira Shava, that it also has to be from this same fine flour. But not as the third category that the pasuk here says, which is rikikin minayin. That's made like a thin matzah. How do I know that also has to be from fine flour? So not as a second Gzeira Shava. Talmud loymar matzahs. It uses the term matzahs, rikike matzahs, and I learned from the term that it says by chalois, it says chalois matzahs. Okay, so here Rami Bacham is saying, I see that I'm doing a double Gzeira Shava. The first Gzeira Shava by chalis matzahs was learned chalis from the chalis murbeches, and then I have a second Gzeira Shava that I learn out matzahs. So I see that you can make one Gzeira Shava and then to a second source, or to learn to a second place, another Gzeira Shava. But Ravina argues on this source. He says, Mimai, the matzahs. How do you know that the second Gzeira Shava of matzahs is learned from what it says here in this pasuk, Michalis Gamar? You're learning it from what it says, Chalis matzahs to the Kike matzahs. Dilme, maybe this second Gzeira Shava of matzahs is learned from a different place. Mimafet Tana Gamar. Maybe it's learned out from a pasuk in a different place in Parshas Vayikra, where it speaks about the korban mincha, which is baked in an oven. And over there in that pasuk, by the Mafer Tanur, it says there itself soiles. You don't have to learn a secondary Gzeira Shava. There it says the word soiles, and maybe there is no second Gzeira Shava on this. Therefore, this is not a good source. So Elamar Rava says, I'll bring you another case where I see that you make one Gzeira Shava, and then based on that, you make a second Gzeira Shava. Because Tanya, we learned in the Braise, it says in the pasuk, and this is a pasuk regarding the par kohen Mashiach, the kohen gadol that did an aveda as to bring a korban chatos. What's one of the unique things about this korban chatos? That the parts of the korban that are not burnt on the mizbeach, you can't eat it. It has to all be taken outside the machna and burnt there. And the pasuk describes and says, "V'kirboy upirshoy v'hoitzi." You take the innards of the animal with the peresh, the waste that's inside the intestines of the animal, and you take it out to burn outside the outside the azara. Now, Melamed, this pasuk comes to teach shemetzia shalom. It has to be taken out all together as one, because when it says v'hoitzi, if you separate them into different pieces, so then you can't take it out all as one. It says v'hoitzi, it means you take it all together out as one. Now, Yachai, I would think, you're taking it out all as one, so then you should also burn it there together all as one. No, but actually, when it comes to burning it outside, you have to separate it into different pieces. You don't burn it all as one. And how do I know that? And here there's a Gzeira Shava, because Ne'emakan Reisha Yikra. In this same pasuk, when it describes bringing out this animal, the parts of the animal, Mechutz Lamachne, the Torah uses the term Reisha Yikra, the head and the legs. And v'nema lahalon, there's a lashon of the pasuk that it says also by the korban oila, reisha yakrav, also says the head and the legs. So malahalon, just like by the korban oila, all the parts of the korban are actually burnt on the mizbeach. But over there, by the korban oila, the pasuk clearly says how is it done? Al yidei nituach. The lashon of the pasuk is v'nosach, that you cut it into pieces, or v'nitach chaysel l'nesachav. That's the lashon. So just like by the korban oila, all the parts that are brought on the mizbeach, you don't put it all as one, but it has to be cut into pieces. Afkan al yidei nituach. So too over here, when you take these pieces of the par kohen Mashiach that has to be brought outside the machna, it's carried all out together as one piece. But then before you burn it, it has to be cut into pieces before it's burnt outside. That's the first Gzeira Shava. Okay, now the Braise clarifies that I would think, ima lahalon, the hefshit, that just like when it comes to the carbon oila, since I'm learning from the carbon oila, so just like there, before you burn the parts of the carbon oila on the mizbeach, it has to be skinned. The hide, the animal is removed. Afkanami behefshit. So I would say that by the Parkai Mashiach that's learned from there should also I have to remove the skin first. So for this I say no. Talmud loymar v'kirboy upirshay. I learned from the pasuk that it says the words v'kirboy upirshay to say that you don't remove the skin. Now the Gemara here interjects the Braise and explains how do I see that? My Talmud. How do I see from the words of kirboy upirshay anything regarding the removing the skin? Rav Papa, so Rav Papa explains, because I compare, I say just like when the pasuk says the pirsha and kirboy, the peresh, which is the waste of the animal, that remains inside the intestines. You don't take that out separately from it. And Rashi says the reason I know this is because it's a dava meguna. It's not. It's despicable to take out the peresh of the animal separately. So kach b'sarai be'oirei. So too in the same pasuk where it talks about the hide and the flesh, it's kept as one, like the kirboy and pirsha itself. This is all one braisa discussing the Parakaya Mashiach that's burnt mechutz lamachna.
This chatas is burnt in its entirety.
Correct. Well, there's parts of it that are brought on the mizbeach, evarim, there's certain, and then all the other parts, which usually by other carbonis, you eat from it. Over here, it's taken outside the machna and burnt there.
No, by some carbonis, the kohen keeps the skin, but over here,
correct,
the skin.
correct. Over here, it's burnt. Yes. Now, V'tanya, so now we come to a second Gezerah Shava, because we learned now in another Braise, Rebbe explains, now this Braise is going to teach us the halacha regarding the par that's brought in Yom Kippur, that also has to be burnt mechutz lamachna. So now it says in that another Braise that Rebbe says, makan oyer basar peresh. It says over here regarding this par that we're speaking about, the par koyah Mashiach. So it speaks about the skin, the flesh, and the peresh, all these things that has to be taken outside the machna. And v'nema lahalon, and also by the par, and also actually the soir on Yom Kippur, the Torah also there mentions in the pasuk these three details: the oir, ubasar, uperesh. So here I learn out the Gezerah Shava. Ma'alalon al yidei nituach shaloi behefshit. Just like it is regarding the Parkai Mashiach, we just learned out from the carbon oila that has to be cut into pieces, but the skin is not removed from it. Afkan, so too by the par of Yom Kippur and also the sar of Yom Kippur, I can now learn out a second Gezerah Shava to compare to it al yidei nituach shaloi behefshit, that it's also brought outside the machna and it's cut into pieces, but you don't remove the skin. So right over here, Rava says, this is where we see that I have one source that was learned with the Gezerah Shava, and that's the Gezerah Shava from the Parkai Mashiach from the Oila, and then from that Gezerah Shava, I then learn out a second Gezerah Shava from the Parkai Mashiach to the Par of Yom Kippur. So the Gemara goes on to the next kind of limud. Davar alamid Gezerah Shava. If you learn something originally only from Gezerah Shava, Mao sheyilamid b'kavachaymer. Could I then learn from that source to another case with a Kavachaymer? Says the Gemara, I'll prove you this point from a Kavachaymer itself. Kavachaymer, I'll make the following Kavachaymer that you can. How? Because Umah Hekish, She'enim Alamed Behekish. When it comes to the limit of a Hekish, you cannot then go ahead and make a second Hekish. As the Gemara brought before in Daf Mem Tes, the source for this, Imid Rava. Rava had one source for this, Imid Ravina, or Ravina had another source for this. Okay, so that shows you that by Hekish we're more limited in making this limit of Hekish. You make once, you can't go a second time. However, Melamed b'kavachaymer, but even by a Hekish that has this limitation, when you learn something from a Hekish, you could then go ahead and learn from there to another case with a Kavachaymer, and that we know Miditana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. The Gemara brought, and this is actually the first few words in Daf Nun Amud Aleph, the Gemara brought the source for this from Rabbi Shmuel said. So if so, Gezerah Shava hamalamedes behekish, when it comes to a Gezerah Shava that you could learn out, once you have a Gezerah Shava, you could then learn out with a Hekish after that. So that shows you that it's less limited when you learn from a Gezerah Shava. Rav Papa, and the Gemara in Amud Aleph brought the source of this according to Rav Papa's opinion that he brought this by the carbon taida. So definitely a Gezerah Shava should not be limited, and you could learn with a Kavachaymer. Again, the point there is I see Hekesh is more limited in the limud, and nevertheless you could learn from a Hekesh to a Kavachaymer. Gezerah Shava, which is less limited in its limud, for sure you could learn from it with a Kavachaymer. Okay, but now this whole Gzeir Shaveh is based on this point that Rav Papa said in Amar Aleph. But as we saw in the Gemara in Amar Aleph, not everybody agrees to what Rav Papa said. That's only according to those that hold of what Rav Papa said. Because Rav Papa brought a source from what ended up being learned out from the Meiser of Chulin. And Rav Papa says you can still learn from there this point that what's learned from Gzeir Shaveh, you could then learn with a Hekesh. But as we saw before, there are those that don't hold of Rav Papa's source. Because if you're learning it from Meiser, so then the original Melamed is not even Hektish Bechlal. It's Chulin. So they didn't hold of Rav Papa. So how are you going to prove the point you're saying it? You can't use this as a source regarding what we're discussing. If you learn something from Gzeir Shaveh, could you then learn it with a Kavachaimer to another place? So the Gemara says, Elo, I'll tell you a different Kavachaimer to prove this point. The Kavachaimer goes as follows. If when it comes to a hekesh and I see that it's limited, you can't learn out to another hekesh. And as we brought the source for this before, so malamed bekavachaimer, but you could learn from a hekesh then to another source with a kavachaimer miditana debei Rabbi Shmuel, as the Gemara brought before the source from Rabbi Shmuel. So Gzeir Shaveh, hamalamedes b'Gzeir Shaveh chaverta. When you have one Gzeir Shaveh, you can then learn to a second Gzeir Shaveh, as the Gemara just brought the source by the Par Kayim Mashiach that was learned from the Oyla, and then we're learning a second Gzeir Shaveh to the part of Yom Kippur. So, Midrami Bar Chama, that was, well, actually the Gemara here says the source of Rami Bar Chama, but some changed the Girsa, because the source of Rami Bar Chama was from the case the Gemara brought before by the Chalais, but that the Gemara really refuted. But there's the second source the Gemara brought from Rava. So Einedin Shetalam B'Kavachaimer. So I see Gzeir Shaveh is less limited. For sure, you should be able to learn from Gzeir Shaveh than to a Kavachaimer. Okay, so we know this point. Another case, Davar Halamed B'Gzeir Shaveh. If you learn something only from Gzeir Shaveh, so Mahu Sheyalamed B'Binyanav. Could I then learn from there with a Binyanav? Teiku, this the Gemara has no way to prove it. Remains unresolved. Okay, the final thing that we're going to learn for today, the Gemara says, Davar halamed b'kavachaimer. If you learn something, so we're going over to a different category. So till here we were discussing when the original limud was a hekesh. The Gemara went through then all secondary limudim after a hekesh, and the Gemara went through all the different kinds of limudim that come after a Gzeir Shaveh, and now kavachaimer. When you have this, the first limud was a kavachaimer, could you then make a secondary limud from that? So the Gemara begins, Davar alamed b'kavachaimer. If something was learned with a kavachaimer, mao sheyalamed behekish. Am I then able to learn from there with a hekish? Says the Gemara, kavachaimer. This as well itself. I have a kavachaimer to prove this point. Because when it comes to a Gzeir Shaveh, you can't learn a Gzeir Shaveh if the original source was only learned from a hekish. And this is proven from where? Mid Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara on Memtes Samid Beis, at the end of the Amid there, Rabbi Yochanan proved this point. So it shows you the limitation of the limit of Gzeir Shaveh. But Melamed Behekesh, but nevertheless, if the original source is the Gzeir Shaveh, so then from there, I could learn to a Hekesh, Mid Rav Papa, and this is according to Rav Papa's opinion, on Amid Aleph here. If so, Kavachaimer, Halamed Mehekesh, Mitana de Rabbi Shmuel, when it comes to a Kavachaimer, if the original source was a Hekish, you then could learn a Kavachaimer from there, as the Gemara learned out from Rabbi Shmuel, and Edain, so you see that Kavachaimer is less limited, and Edain, Sheyalamed Be'Hekish. So therefore now to learn from a Kavachaimer to a Hekish, definitely you should be able to do that. But now the Gemara again says the point that it said before, this whole Kavachaimer you just made is based on Rav Papa. But not everybody agrees. This Kavachaimer works according to those that agree to Rav Papa. But Rav Papa, as we saw in Amar Aleph, those that don't agree to Rav Papa, so you can't make this Kavachaimer here regarding this question, whether when you have a source, a Kavachaimer, could I then learn to another Hekish? So Teiku, this remains unresolved as well. Oh, actually, one more for today. One more thing to learn out here. This is a little bit interesting, a little bit of a tongue twister here, what the Gemara is going to say now. Davar halamed b'kavachaimer mao sheyalamed. Where am I over here? Davar halamed b'kavachaimer Oh, sorry. So there's two more for today here. There's this one and then the next one. Okay, let's see. Davar alamed b'kavachaymer ma'u sheyalamed b'gzeira shava. If I learn something from a kavachaymer, could I then learn from there to another case with gzeira shava? So this as well, the Gemara says, I could learn with a kavachaymer. Kavachaymer, I have the following kavachaymer. What is that? Gzeira shava she'ena lameida be'akeshe. A gzeira shava cannot be made after the original source was learned only with a hekesh. And how do I know that? Mid Rabbi Yechanan, as the Gemara brought in Daf Mem test the source of this from Rabbi Yechanan said, but melamed the gzeira shava. But nevertheless, from one gzeira shava, I could learn to another gzeira shava. Mid Rami Bachame, from what Rami Bachame said, or as the conclusion of the Gemara was from what Rava said. So if so, kavachaymer halamid behekesh, a kavachaymer that is less limited. I see a kavachaymer could be learnt out, even though the original source was learned from a hekesh. Meditana de Rabbi Shmuel, as the source was brought from Rabbi Shmuel. And it then shetalamid big zayda shava. Definitely, this kavachaymer. Once I know something based on a kavachaymer, it then could become a source to learn from there with a zayda shava. Okay, so this is resolved. This is simple. The final thing is davar halamed bekavachaymer. Oh, this is the over here, the lashon of the Gemara here. We'll see. It's this a little bit of a tongue twister. So when you have something that's learned with a kavachaymer, mao sheyalamed bekavachaymer. Could I then learn from a source that was only known from a kavachaymer? Could I then learn to a second kavachaymer? Says the Gemara, this itself is also a kavachaymer. What's the kavachaymer? When it comes to a gzeira shava, which is limited, it cannot be learned out if the original source comes from a hekesh, like Rabbi Yechanan said. But nevertheless, melamed bekavachaymer, I could learn out from a gzeira shava to a kavachaymer. And where's our source for this? Kidda amaran, like we said before. And when the Gemara here says kidda amaran, this kidda amaran means that this point itself, that from a gzeira shava I could learn out to a kavachaymer. This itself I only know with a kavachaymer. Okay, that's an important point for what the Gemara is going to say soon. So kedamaran, that this itself we only know from a kavachaymer. So kavachaymer halamid mehekish. When I see a kavachaymer itself, it's less limited because a kavachaymer could be learned out from another place that its source was a hekesh. Midetana de Rabbi Shmuel, like Rabbi Shmuel said. So einedain she'lamid bekavachaymer. Most definitely, I could learn out from here now to another kavachaymer. Okay, so we have here this kavachaymer, which is really based on, a part of this kavachaymer is based on what we see by gzeira shava, that itself I only know from a kavachaymer. Okay, so now the Gemara says on this, v'zel kavachaymer ben kavachaymer. This is a kavachaymer that's based on another kavachaymer. Okay, so now the way to understand this is, the halacha that you're going to be learning out with your final kavachaymer here, that's a kavachaymer. And how do you know that this kavachaymer is legitimate? You're only learning this kavachaymer from another kavachaymer who says that you can make a secondary kavachaymer. You only know that from the kavachaymer that the Gemara just made. So therefore, this kavachaymer that you're learning from a kavachaymer and the legitimacy to make such a kavachaymer is based on a kavachaymer. So this is a kavachaymer that's a son of a kavachaymer. Well, no, first the Gemara says it's a son of a kavachaymer. There's two kavachaymers here. But now the Gemara asks on this, it's actually three kavachaymers. Ben Aishla kavachaymer. And if you look at what's happening here, it's really three kavachaymers. Why is there three kavachaymers? There's the final halacha that you're learning out, which you're learning out from a kavachaymer. That kavachaymer you're learning based on another kavachaymer that came before it. And then how do you know b'chlal this concept that you could learn out a kavachaymer from a kavachaymer that itself was based on a kavachaymer, where over there it was all based on a kavachaymer. As I mentioned before, the kidda amaran that the Gemara said before, which you learned from the gzeira shava, was all based on a kavachaymer. So it comes out that you have three different kavachaymers that this halacha, that this final halacha is going to be based on. So Rashi says what the Gemara means to be asking over here is, if so, maybe we're going too far. We started off the discussion over here, could you have a secondary kavachaymer? Well, this is already using a third tier to this kavachaymer. Who says you can go that far? Okay, so therefore the Gemara does not accept this limud. Ella says the Gemara, so let's go to a case where it's simpler. Ella kavachaymer, let's make a kavachaymer regarding what we're discussing, whether you could learn out a secondary kavachaymer from the following. Ma hekesh, she'ein elamed behekesh. When you have one hekesh, you can't learn a second hekesh. Either Rav is a source or Ravina is a source. But melamed bekavachaymer, from a hekesh, you could then learn from to a kavachaymer. Midetana de Rabbi Shmuel, as Rabbi Shmuel said. So now kavachaymer halamed me hekesh. So that regarding this point itself, since you see that a kavachaymer itself is not as limited, it could be learned from a source that was learned from a hekesh. Midetana de Rabbi Shmuel. So enidain she alamed bekavachaymer. Definitely, it's less limited. You could learn from one kavachaymer to a second kavachaymer. And vizel kavachaymer ben kavachaymer. This is two kavachaymers there. You have the kavachaymer, and then you're learning it out from another kavachaymer. So that the Gemara says is a double kavachaymer, and that's okay. And therefore, this is the source that you can learn out one kavachaymer from another kavachaymer. Okay, there's another part of this, but this goes here down to the next number. So we'll continue next time.